having written 7 books, including Alt-Reich, Failing States, Collapsing Systems. His work has earned him multiple prestigious awards for both investigative journalism and academic research. As an investigative journalist, he's reported for Byline Times, Vice, Middle East Eye, and The Guardian, covering everything from geopolitics to environmental crises and technological disruptions. He's a recognized leader in climate and sustainability. He's played key roles in major UN climate summits like COP26 and COP28. And finally, he's a thought leader and fellow of esteemed organizations like the Club of Rome, the Schumacher Institute, and the Royal Society of Arts. Over to you.
You're on mute.
Oh, sorry. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. My name is Khalid Anis, and I have the great pleasure of asking our author, Nafeez, who's written this superb book that I would thoroughly recommend everybody to read. But we're going to explore some of the themes within the book, and we're really very honored to have Nafeez with us. Nafeez, thank you so much for taking the time out to kind of go through some of really what I think are the issues of our time, really, and quite monumental issues. And I think especially for the people who are on this call, who are really kind of young adults, young leaders from within the Muslim community, important, of course, for them to know about this and understand it. And so what we're going to try and do through this time, perhaps, is think about where we are, maybe how we got here, and importantly, where we go from here, if that's okay. So if I can kick off question number one, Nafeez, what inspired you to write this brilliant book, Alt-Reich, and what key revelations does the book offer about the far right's influence in Western democracies?
Well, assalamu alaikum, first of all, and thank you so much for hosting me today. It's a real pleasure to be able to connect with you guys and have this opportunity to talk about my work and share with you, and really excited to get stuck in and have a really deep conversation about some of the issues that we're going through. And hopefully this can be a constructive and forward-looking exploration. So what inspired me to write this book? I mean, it's an interesting question because I guess I've been tracking these types of organizations and networks for something like 15 years. And in recent years, I began to move away from investigative journalism and focus more on system change work, which I was already doing, but I decided actually that I wanted to do less investigations. And the reason for that is, honestly, I was almost traumatized by some of the things I was coming across, and it was just feeling like, what's the point of doing all this stuff, writing about these people, and where's it going? And so I wrote an article last year about Michael Gove, who you may know is a long-standing former Conservative minister, a long-standing Tory MP, started off as a journalist, had this lifelong obsession with Muslims and calling a kind of suspicion on Muslim communities, and various other things and issues. So he, last year, you may or may not remember, but he suddenly came out with this, in the Tory government, with this big extremism drive, and we need a whole revamp of counter-extremism. And he came up with a kind of new way of trying to look at extremism, and the definition is much broader. He wanted a much broader approach, all this stuff. So I actually wrote an article in Byline Times called Michael Gove, the Extremist. And I documented his track record of extremism from being a student and using racial slurs against black people, to toying around with eugenics ideology, all the way through to demonizing Muslim communities wholesale as a potential kind of fifth column in the UK and all this kind of stuff. So put that all together. And then my wife said to me, she said, Nafeez, you know, this was a really like interesting article and it's just gone viral. And you know, you should just bring together all of the other stuff that you've got about these different individuals and just write a book on them and just get it out there, name and shame everyone. And I was like, no, I don't want to do that. Why would I want to dedicate all my time to that? And then I remember I was talking to my editors about it, and they were like, yeah, we'd publish that. And they just kind of gave me this look like, okay, we need to do this, you know, Nafeez. And so that was it. The kind of decision was made for me. Everybody else like, Nafeez, you need to go on it. So anyway, we decided to do it. And I spent, you know, this was like last, you know, April or something or May. So as you can imagine, we put it together. I drew a lot of, a lot on my previous work to pull the book together. So over the next 6 months, I was, amongst other things, while running a day job, was putting this book together. And I don't think anyone had really anticipated how timely it would be when we finally got it ready for release. We knew we wanted to have the book ready in time. Ideally, we were racing to get it ready for the elections, the American elections. But we ended up getting it out shortly after the elections. And then it felt at the time like like a fairly almost astoundingly prescient reflection of what was actually happening in America.
Okay, and so just on the second part of that question about what would you pull as the key revelations from the book about the far right's influence within the West?
So this is, I think, the book tells the story of how we got here,
Yeah,
in a way I think that hasn't been done before. There's loads of books about the far right, you know, which you can imagine they're not necessarily that fun to read.
yeah,
I would say this book actually tells you a story which goes all the way back to the 1930s, before the Second World War, obviously when we had the Nazi Holocaust.
yeah,
And it actually tells that story of how a group of white supremacists and Nazis and Nazi sympathizers after the Second World War continued to attempt to exert influence on politics in the Western world and attempted to tactically shapeshift in order to expand their influence into the mainstream. And it took them a long time. It took them decades. But they worked with mainstream institutions from fairly early on. They were working on the outskirts. And what the book does, and I think what it reveals, is how traditional Nazi eugenics and white supremacism actually began to influence the political discourse in the mainstream in a really insidious way, and in a way which to this day is not really understood, to the point that it has influenced the shape of major economic policies, it's influenced the thinking of mainstream political parties, and of course, it has influenced the direction of rising far-right parties, and it has culminated in the far-right takeover of the Republican Party, the rise of the Reform Party in the UK. It's pushing forward the rise of extreme right-wing ideology across Europe, and it's even, you know, seeping across into other countries as well. Even in the South, whether you look at places like Argentina or you look at the struggles in Brazil, you look at India, uh, you know, you can see the influence of this ideology, and it's actually quite alarming and astounding.
and what's really interesting actually, Nafeez, is that you started off by mentioning Gove. Now, when I was kind of in younger days, we had, you know, the far right in a different guise, in a much more obvious guise. And that then started to develop into a more kind of shape shifting, if you like, into the Nick Griffins of this world and the BNPs. And then that's progressed to the Tommy Robinsons. And then that's progressed, to the Goves and the Farages. And it's just interesting that perhaps when I was a teenager, it was easy to demarcate the far right and to kind of push them aside. Less so now.
That's right. I think, if you go back, and I think this is what is so almost difficult to stomach, really. You and I will remember the days of um, being scared to walk out on the streets because you might get called a Paki, or, worse, you might even be assaulted or attacked by a racist. That, there was a time when this was kind of normal, and you had to be vigilant. And of course, not everyone experienced that. Um, but in many parts of the country, that was a very normal thing. I was fairly fortunate, I think. I had a reasonably, safe upbringing. I grew up in the East End in Ilford, fairly well-to-do kind of area. Um, of course, the racism was still common, and that's the irony that I would get called a Paki every so often, kind of fairly normal. You're going past the train station, some dude would be there, call you a Paki. You'd get a bit riled, a bit scared. People would make jokes in school about, brown people smelling like curry, and that would be kind of funny, and everyone would laugh about it. You'd feel kind of weird and awkward. That kind of thing was so even in a kind of context of safety, racism was that kind of casual racism was there. So when you saw groups like the far right, however, who were talking about, very openly being racist at that time, it was seen as fringe. It was seen as, that's way beyond the pale. Um, but what was interesting is how that began to shift. And I think what the book shows is many of these groups realized that they wouldn't be able to have influence if they continued down that hardline path. So what they began to do was tactically kind of conceal that hardline core and move into other areas. And Nick Griffin is a great example of this because obviously the British National Party, the BNP, was is a neo-Nazi party. And one of it had a paramilitary wing called Combat 18. It was also had ties with the National Front, which is another kind of very militaristic group. And now these, Combat 18 and National Front were literally kind of violent, thuggish groups. And my wife tells the stories of how her and her family were regularly attacked in their cafe by Combat 18 thugs who would be roaming the streets. And it was absolutely terrifying. So what happened is Nick Griffin, um, he got to power and he was like, we're never going to get political influence on this platform. We need to change the approach. So he started saying, let's focus on immigration. Let's just not, don't focus on the fact that we want to repatriate forcibly other races. Let's say we want to stop immigration and control immigration. Then he was like, instead of talking about forced repatriation, why don't we talk about voluntary repatriation? So actually, the state would pay money to ethnic minorities, or maybe not ethnic minority, all ethnic minorities, but particularly newly arrived immigrants to go back home. And this was kind of the light tactical shift. As time went on, it began to move increasingly towards just saying, well, why don't we just focus on Muslims? Let's just focus on Islam. That's much easier. Let's talk about culture rather than race, because we always get called racist. So if we talk about culture and religion, we're not going to be called racist. So they began focusing on Islam and Muslims. And that was part of like a wider shift that was happening geopolitically. After the Second World War, the immediate attention was on the communists because the next threat after Nazi Germany was the Soviet Union. And the Nazis, ironically, actually exploited this. There were a whole bunch of Nazi intelligence officers that were recruited into the American intelligence community to help them understand the threat from the Soviet Union. Now, ironically, what these guys did, and many intelligence officers even spoke about this now, and it's kind of come out from the declassified record, is they just went around exaggerating the communist threat. And of course, there were issues with the Soviet Union Um, but the Soviet Union was an authoritarian, terrible regime, responsible for the death of millions of people internally. All sorts of atrocities were committed. However, um, what came out from the evidence was that they weren't imminently going to invade the West. That was not going to happen. So these Nazis were actually working inside the American intelligence community and fabricating intelligence
Nafeez,
about the
sorry, just
communist
to press
threat.
you on that, just to press you on that just a little, because when you said that, when I saw you kind of your book launch, it kind of really struck. So were these Nazis working within America, known Nazis, or were they kind of people who kind of just had a different point of view?
So this actually started when the Hitler's head of intelligence in in Western Europe, uh, and on the Eastern Front. His name was Reinhard Gehlen. He basically, when it was clear that the West was going to win the war, he defected and he turned up in the United States, I believe, with a bunch of papers. Or I don't. It wasn't the United States. It was South America that he originally fled to South America. Had a bunch of papers, met some American intelligence officers, and he said, "Look, these are the files that we have on the Soviets." And he cut a deal with them. And that deal was a pretty good deal because they then flew him into the United States. They set up a organization called the Gehlen Organization, which was run out of the Office for Strategic Services, which was a precursor organization to the CIA. That organization was running during the Second World War, actually to defeat the Nazis. They then recruited him to set up his own organization. He recruited hundreds and then ultimately thousands of Nazi intelligence officers. Many of these people were war criminals and they worked with the Nazi SS. Some really, really horrible people. The Butcher of Auschwitz even was part of this brigade. They knew what they were doing. But what was interesting was that the President of the United States did not know that this was happening at the time. When this first started, it was done, it was this is what you call, pure black operation. Like it was right compartmentalized. No one knew except the deepest, darkest recesses of the intelligence community. So they did that, and obviously this had an interesting impact. And we don't really know what impact that might have had, but it obviously shaped the culture and institution of the intelligence services at that time. That doesn't mean everyone was a Nazi. Obviously, they were, there were hundreds and thousands of people in the intelligence community who were just normal, who were not Nazis, but they'd brought these people in, and obviously had to hide their beliefs because they now had to say, "Look, we are pro-American. We are renouncing our Nazi history. We are not Nazis. We don't like Nazis anymore." And we are loyal and we hate communists. And
Yeah.
communism is the enemy, and we're going to help you fight the communists. So they exaggerated this threat of the Soviet Union, and they kept putting out this intelligence that was actually way overblown. Um, and obviously, when the Soviet Union actually collapsed, that left kind of a vacuum
Yeah.
because what was the next kind of big thing that was going to be, the reason why we were going all over the place. The United States was doing things, and so the Islamic world was seen as the next kind of big kind of bogeyman kind of problem area, and that was really encapsulated by this guy called Samuel Huntington. He wrote this famous book called The Clash of Civilizations, where he put forward this theory that the frontier of future conflict was all going to be between different civilizations. And so he was like, well, now that the Soviet Union civilization has kind of gone down, the next big thing is going to be the Islamic civilization. And so that kind of fit in to the way in which the American kind of global order was evolving. Um, and I think that kind of fit that kind of created an opening then for many of these kind of far right groups to say, well, we agree actually that
Yeah.
the threat is from the Muslim world and from Muslims. And so you saw this kind of gradual radicalization process take place. But what's really crucial to understand is in this process, the fundamental structure of far right ideology, it didn't really change.
Yeah.
It had the same fundamental kind of hatred of the other,
Yeah.
and they still hated Jews and they still hated black people. But what happened is it began to not was it it was a tactical shift, but obviously there were people who still believed certain core things. But as it was evolving and changing and coming across new ideas and new institutions, then and more people were being brought in, it began to be a complex network, right? So many people who were coming in, they were coming on the edges and they were attracted by the outskirts of that ideology. They were attracted by the anti-immigrant stuff. They were maybe attracted by the anti-Muslim stuff. Maybe weren't didn't know about that there was also an anti-Semitic core that was right there. And that's why you find that the network connects up quite contradictory types of racism,
Yeah.
and these get activated almost at different times.
But I suppose at the base, even when the Nazis came into the kind of American system, at the base, they're both really quite racist societies. I mean, the Nazis are obviously racist, but the American society at that time was also, quite racist. So I suppose that there's a kind of mutual kind of othering, if you like, in that. So Nafeez, why don't we just because money obviously plays a big role, doesn't it, in all of this? So could you just briefly, because I know it's quite a big kind of topic, but could you elaborate a little bit on, I think it's the Nazi aligned Pioneer Fund and today's kind of far right, and perhaps how money and economic policies have been pulled into the far right, and just kind of paint a picture of how money plays the role now?
Absolutely, sure. So the Nazi Pioneer Fund, this organization is a centerpiece of the story of the alt-right. The Nazi Pioneer Fund is an organization that was set up in the 1930s. It was set up in New York, founded by a textiles magnate, an American by the name of William Draper, who was a Nazi sympathizer. So the Pioneer Fund was essentially seeing itself at that time as an outpost of Nazi Germany in the United States. They were in close contact with the Nazi Germans, including German eugenicists, and they were sharing ideas and research. So at that time, they were it was a vicious cycle of pseudo-scientific eugenics research. Now, you guys may have heard of eugenics on and off, but you might also be wondering what is that? What is eugenics? So let's get down to it a little bit. To put it very simply, eugenics is the belief in a biologically based hierarchy of within amongst human beings. Essentially, they believe that human beings are not really one race, but a hierarchy of races. It's they use genetic pseudoscience, and by pseudoscience I mean kind of it's not real science, but at the time they thought this was really good science, um, and they used this to essentially try to do this research to divide up humanity into these different races, and obviously within that hierarchy, as you can imagine, white European males tend to be at the top of the hierarchy. Women are inferior to men, and people of different colors are inferior to all of them. Um, so that's the general kind of hierarchy. And of course, eugenics was not unique to the Nazis. Eugenics was something that was kind of inspired by various interpretations of, um, the theory of evolution, Darwin's theory of evolution. I mean, he was not advocating a eugenics ideology, but there were social Darwinists who took his stuff and essentially distorted it and gave it this very social kind of political kind of implications. Now, the Nazis and the Americans began to really do systematic research around this, and that was where they began sharing their ideas. So what happened then? They were active in after the Second World War. The Nazi Pioneer Fund kind of shifted its attention, whereas before they were focused on disseminating Nazi ideology in the US. So, for instance, they would take videos promoting Nazi Germany and they'd be distributing them, doing screenings and things like that. They began to shift very much. They realized that being openly anti-Semitic was not going to wash. I mean, literally, you just imagine the Americans have just crushed Nazi Germany militarily. You can't go around waving the Nazi flag and thinking you're going to make friends. Like, that's not going to happen. So instead, they would be like focusing on black people. And so the biggest focus was the civil rights movement and to combat the civil rights movement. These people were already, while they were talking about Jewish people and the lack of Jewish intelligence and things like that, they were saying the same things about black people. So the focus shifted from the 50s and 60s in campaigning against civil rights, campaigning for segregation, and this became a really big deal. So they began so you have this money that's come in from these textiles kind of industries, so these people who've made their money out of these industries. Um, and then they began working with mainstream Republican politicians, and the Pioneer Fund worked with many kind of big names in the Republican Party at that time to campaign against civil rights. That was just the beginning of this process of infiltration of the Republican Party. That continued and I think kind of reached a crescendo by the time you get to um, the 1970s. You see how these groups were influencing one of the biggest conservative institutions in America. You guys might have heard of it. It's called the Heritage Foundation. Now, if you guys have been following American politics and you might have heard of Project 2025, and you might have heard that, last year Trump and his cronies were pushing forward this crazy plan called Project 2025, which was all about tearing down the fundamentals of democracy, making kind of the American government extremely centralized, kind of empowering Trump to take control of the executive branch and all of the other levers of government, and also doing mad things like essentially turning America into a bit of a theocratic state. In other words, a state which is based on religion. Yes, saying that the state should be a Christian state, targeting minorities, destroying civil rights programs, eliminating diversity, equity, inclusion, all the stuff that we're actually seeing happening now on our screens. Project 25 was saying this. So the organization that has hatched Project 25 was the Heritage Foundation. And they actually do this every year when, they not every year, but for every election, they produce a kind of a mandate and a roadmap for the Republican Party and for a potential Republican government. So they did this again. It was a 900-page mammoth paper with contributions from, I think, something like 100 odd conservative institutions across the United States. But what's really disturbing and what the book shows is that the Heritage Foundation, right from inception, had quite close ties to Nazi sympathizers. One of the key characters in this story is a guy called Ed Fuellner. Ed Fuellner was a co-founder of the Heritage Foundation. And he was involved in many other conservative institutions. So one of the things that he did when shortly after founding the Heritage Foundation, is he recruited a guy called Roger Pearson. Roger Pearson was an avid neo-Nazi. He was head of something called the Northern League, which was a well-known, at the time, neo-Nazi organization. He was funded by the Pioneer Fund. He was at one point then became a director at the Pioneer Fund. He became editor of the Pioneer Fund's main journal that he had created called Mankind Quarterly, which was a kind of a flagship eugenics journal. And Roger Pearson became a kind of stalwart figure in the Heritage Foundation, where he was involved in kind of editing the main kind of policy journal called Policy Review. He was involved in a number of Republican committees. He set up an organization called the World Anti-Communist League. So we're getting into some granular detail, but that's just to give you an idea of how bizarre this whole but how kind of incestuous those relationships were, and that continued. So from the Heritage Foundation, and you can see that kind of trail. Ed Fuellner also was co-director of another organization called the Manhattan Policy Research Institute, or something to that effect, and they later kind of rebranded as the Manhattan Institute. Now, the Manhattan Institute received funding from another big foundation called I think it's the Harry and Bradley Lynn Foundation, or the Harry and or something like that. Call it the Bradley Foundation for short. The Bradley Foundation is a major conservative philanthropy. Most of the money that they have from it's a big it's a family came from industrial automation. And one of the patterns that we keep seeing is some of the most powerful, wealthiest people in the United States who have control over key industries, whether maybe fossil fuel industries, key kind of certain industries, maybe tobacco, all this different kind of stuff. They were setting up these philanthropies and funding some of these very strange things. So one of the key people that they funded was a character called Charles Murray, distinguished American social scientist. Um, he was funded by the Pioneer Fund, sorry, by the Bradley Foundation to do this research that led to his book called The Bell Curve. And this is where things get really crazy. So The Bell Curve is a book which was kind of become the Bible of scientific racism. It's the modern day book which took research funded by the Pioneer Fund in the preceding decades. So while all this was going on, the Pioneer Fund was quietly funding various researchers at American universities, giving them grants, doing eugenics research he took all that stuff and he wrote this book and then he repackaged it and he said, I've just done this statistical analysis and it shows that actually there are these he called them kind of these cognitive hierarchies in society, which were based on race. And he said these are largely driven by eugenics, by genetics. So the ultimate thesis was that black people are stupider than white people, and there's nothing you can do about it. And this is responsible for most of the problems that we see in society. Now, Charles Murray, after writing this book, and what was interesting about it is that he very carefully excised the Nazi origins of these ideas from visibility. Just to give you one example of that, which is so crucial, he referred to a guy called Henry Laughlin, who was a director of the Pioneer Fund, an avid Nazi, like he's very pro-Nazi, very anti-Semitic. He was one of the people who was really, really calling for immigration of Jewish people to America to be stopped because he said, they had low IQ. Now, in the book, Charles Murray actually refers to him in really glowing terms, and he says Henry Laughlin was an amazing guy, and he was very, very kind of conscientious of wanting to ensure that he maintained the levels of American intelligence in society through controlled immigration. So he gave this nice kind of glowing kind of repackaging of what was going on at that time and took away all the Nazi and anti-Semitic connotations.
So, I mean, in a way, what you've described there, I mean, it's fascinating to follow that money trail and how that comes. But in a way, you've described something that was very hush, but now seems to be very open. So I just wanted to draw you towards where we find ourselves today with the likes of Zuckerberg, Musk, and all these guys who have kind of bought in. They seem to be buying in or part of this whole kind of network. I mean, Trump is obviously there, and you mentioned that at the beginning Gove, obviously, and kind of the characters around the world. So is this still the same far-right network that we're talking about, that they're becoming more emboldened now?
So what I want to make clear is that this was not what we the situation that we have today is the result of multiple different interests and factions moving in certain directions and having networked connections to each other. It's not a conspiracy in that sense. It's not one singular grand plan. Of course, there are different groups who are conspiring, working together with making plans, at the local level, at the national level. But these are different ideas, different plans. But the more these people have been talking to each other and coordinating, the more that coordination has become a little bit more systematic. The more that they've found that they share ideas, and the more that they've come to converge on kind of like a set of shared goals and ideas. And one of the things that has driven this process is the role of people around the Pioneer Fund attempting to mainstream these ideas and make them palatable and make the consequences of those ideas palatable, even if you don't understand where they come from, to make sure that those ideas are picked up. So Charles Murray was very instrumental in this. And one of the things the book does is it traces how Charles Murray and the impact of his ideas ended up being connected with so many different groups and institutions that it begins to explain what you might call a global radicalization process. People talk about radicalization, oh, Muslims being radicalized here. Actually, us Muslims, because we have seen some of these challenges that have gone on in parts of the Muslim world, we're quite familiar with the radicalization process. We recognize the challenge. We have been fighting this challenge in our communities. We have been calling out extremists. We've been, so we know actually how this radicalization process can work. We have seen it. So applying that kind of knowledge, looking at these organizations, I was saying, well, actually, you're seeing that these groups, many of these people didn't necessarily hold these views 10, 15 years ago, but they became radicalized by hearing the ideas of Charles Murray, and they were laundered through different institutions and different mechanisms, and eventually they began picking up and they began moving their ideas into this extreme space, and they didn't even realize that this is where they were going to end up. And that's a really extraordinary story that we see taking place. And just to give you one example of this, which really hits home how extraordinary the impact was. So Charles Murray, obviously, he's there. He's already got this kind of link with heritage, with Manhattan Institute. Manhattan Institute is a quite impactful organization in the United States. So you can imagine the Bradley Foundation has funded this. So one of the things that happened shortly after that is, first of all, amazingly enough, Bill Clinton actually implemented welfare regulation uh, based on Charles Murray's ideas, um, which is extraordinary. In the 1990s, they decided to restrict welfare state spending because of Charles Murray's ideas. So you're thinking, why did this happen? So the thing is that Charles Murray went around saying that if you look at the economic implications of this, if we're saying that there's a group of people that are problematic, that, whether they're black or whether some of them are of another color, but they're predominantly darker skinned or ethnic, and they're impoverished and they're unproductive, and this is really due to genetics and a combination of environmental factors. But ultimately, what it means is no matter how much money we throw at these people, they're never going to improve. What does that mean? It means, first of all, stop spending money on these people. Stop your social welfare programs. It's a waste of money. Focus your money on the more productive sectors of the population, which are white people who are more privileged. So you should have you'd have a tiered education system, and of course, what that also means is that you should have a state which doesn't interfere in the economy then, because you don't need the state to be looking at how to spend money. You should be shrinking the spending of the state, and you should be allowing people with money to spend that as they want because they're the cleverest people and they know what to do. So massive deregulation, massive privatization, unleash capital, let it do what it wants. Um, and so if you guys think about that, what is the economic program that that implies? That is standard, what you might call a neoliberal or neoclassical economics. That is mainstream modern economic theory, which is responsible for most of the way Western governments run their economies today, especially in the United States and the UK. A bit less so in Europe, but very much here. So he was flown over, just to finish this point. How did that idea get mainstreamed? Not only did he influence Bill Clinton, he influenced Ronald Reagan. He was flown over by Rupert Murdoch to Britain. He was paid by Murdoch to write articles in the Sunday Times. He wrote briefings for the Institute for Economic Affairs, which is which is that hard Brexit think tank, which is massively influential on the Conservative Party thinking. And he not only briefed with them, he met with Number 10, he met with Treasury officials, he met with Margaret Thatcher herself. So that was the massive impact that he had on both sides of the Atlantic. And that was just the beginning. From there, he also had an impact. And you asked the question about, what about Zuckerberg? What about Elon Musk? What about Peter Thiel? What about all these guys? His ideas even influenced philosophers in the technology world who were thinking about the future of humanity and the future of technology. And he began influencing those ideas as well. And so his ideas just began to seep everywhere into the mainstream. And many people didn't realize that his ideas were based on Nazi eugenics. And because of the way in which the Chinese whispers mode in which his ideas were spreading, many people were picking up these ideas. And I didn't even know that they came from him.
Yeah, yeah, I get that. So, I mean, there's so much to unpack here,
So much to
and
unpack, yeah.
I do want to allow kind of the people on this to ask questions as well. But let's see if we can just pull together a couple of strands. They literally, I know we could go on a long time on this, but if you can just try and summarize. So we know that, for example, technology and social media are playing a significant role at the moment in spreading and normalizing kind of far right ideologies, especially amongst young people. And so, given that, and maybe you might want to just reflect on that as well, but given that, how can young adults today, what's their role in counteracting these far right narratives?
It's a good question. I think I would say that young people very much need to kind of resist the urge, which is totally understandable, to look away, right? Because I think everyone feels that, right? You're looking at what's going on and you're thinking, this is insane. I'd much rather go out and have fun with my mates, do something totally different. What is this? Do you know what I mean? I can't deal with this. But I think what we're also beginning to see is that this is going to affect us. This is affecting us.
Yeah.
You can't just look away and think it's not going to have an impact. And at worst, it could have an impact right here in this country. And that's why the subtitle of my book is called The Network War to Destroy the West from Within, because I think what we're seeing is there is a deliberate strategy to destroy democracy. I mean, we didn't even get to that point, but there are ideologies in Silicon Valley which have been floating around. One of them is called the Dark Enlightenment, which is an actual ideology which we have very good reasons to think that people like Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, who is another funder of Trump, another Silicon Valley kind of behemoth, and several other big Silicon Valley tech bros who have been funding Trump, who are very powerful in the current government, actually literally believe that democracy should be smashed, and they think they believe in a very different type of global order. So we're moving into a very bizarre and strange phase. Faced with that reality, I think young people actually have an opportunity, because the way I see this is the last gasp of a dying system. There's many fundamental reasons to kind of explain why this is a dying system. We can go into it in questions and stuff. But I can tell you as a systems theorist, as someone who studied this for 20 years, that this is a system which is basically in crisis and collapse. And this is really what this is a symptom of that. The shift to authoritarianism and extremism is something that doesn't just happen out of the blue, it happens in crisis.
Yeah.
Even the Second World War and Nazi Germany, what they did happened in the context of a massive economic crisis. People go mental when there's a crisis. It's
Yeah.
kind of the thing, right? Now, what that means is that there's actually an opportunity emerging here to create something new, because these guys are not going to actually win because they don't understand reality. They are living in a fantasy world, right? Eugenics is not real, which means that the economy that they think is going to work doesn't work in that way. There's a real world out there and it works in a certain way. If that model of economics doesn't work and you keep trying to apply it, you're going to create catastrophe increasingly, right? So what's going to happen is these guys are going to keep tearing things down, just like Trump did in 2016, right? He basically got into power, and in the end, people said, "We're fed up of you." The pandemic happened, reality comes at you fast. You know, the fact that we're on this planet and we're interconnected and there is an ecology, and there's all sorts of complexity comes at you really fast. We just had wildfires sweeping across LA. Mel Gibson, Hollywood actor, was doing a podcast talking about climate change not being real. His house was completely destroyed in Hollywood. So reality does come at you fast, and I think the Quran talks to us about every nation has its term. So stuff is going to happen, but I think as Muslims, um, we have a slightly different and more hopeful perspective. We're not caught up in the idea that the grand plans of the pharaohs of the world are going to succeed. We realize that the pharaohs can't win. They can never win. And like the Quran says, they plan, but Allah's planning, right? And so the way I see this is that for young people today, whether you're Muslim or non-Muslim, you faith or no faith, the challenge is, first of all, to really work on upgrading our understanding of what is happening in the world, really get to grips with it, build our resilience. That not only means creating and upgrading our critical thinking faculties, because right now, there is a war on our minds. And I don't just mean in terms of what facts they want you to believe, I mean in terms of your ability to think. You are going to be bombarded with stuff which is designed to confuse you and degrade your ability to distinguish what is real. And in such a way that you will be surprised at the fact that we find ourselves gravitating in a tribalistic way to what we want to believe.
Yeah.
And what we want to believe is not necessarily reality. So it doesn't just cut across, let's find out what Trump is doing, let's find out what those guys are doing. It cuts across to how we understand ourselves and our communities and our own responsibility and the failures of our own selves and our own ummah. Really hard truths about who we are and how we got to this space and how we got to this point of vulnerability. So there's a lot of work to do, I think, in ourselves to kind of upgrade our ability to begin to understand what's happening. That's number one. And the second thing I would say that we need to be doing, which is also crucially important, is having one understood the reality, and this is the reality of what's going on, so we can become experts in communicating it, right?
Yeah.
The second thing is, what are we building? And this is the most critical thing of all. As a young person, what is the vision that I am contributing to? What is it that Islam actually was about? We talk about Islam, we have the Islamic Society of Britain. What is it actually that this is all about? One of the things that I think is deeply worrying about the way Muslim groups and institutions are doing things today is that we're very reactionary. Stuff happens and we react. This is happening. Islamophobia is happening. It's very terrible. Islamophobia. Can you imagine if the Prophet campaigned on a platform of Islamophobia when he was dealing with Jahiliyyah? Can you imagine how absurd that would be? Dealing with Islamophobia is not a platform. It's a reaction. I'm not saying don't deal with Islamophobia. Of course, we have to deal with it. But is that the be all and end all of what it means to like do stuff as Muslims in Britain? I don't think so. I think as Muslims, we have such a wonderful, vibrant, we have the vision, guys. We have the number one ultimate vision of how to be a human being, right? How to build a vibrant, ecological, prosperous, harmonious, pluralistic civilization where multiple faiths can live together, coexist, and move towards recognition of reality and alignment with shared values that Allah refers to in the Quran, his divine names. And he says, please, Allah, Prophet says he brought us. Why did he bring Islam? Why is there anything? So that we can build moral character, so we can reflect these divine names in our character, in our being. So I think the question we have before us is, what is that vision
Yeah.
that we want to contribute to our society, and how do we enroll people of all faiths and backgrounds into that vision? Because this is what the Prophet managed to do. Obviously, many people became Muslim at that time, but he managed to bring together Jewish communities, Christian communities, even pagan communities, and Islam managed to spread to so many different vast areas of the world. This was fundamentally a vision of bringing people together on this
A
shared
vision of
path.
shared values, isn't it?
Yes.
A vision of shared values based on justice and kind of, and bringing together people from different communities. So that's brilliant. Now, let me just ask you a little bit more about how we get the information. Okay, so because you mentioned about people having knowledge about what's going on and really understanding it, but I feel that there's been a degradation, whether you may or may not agree with me, in what we call mainstream media. And, I've watched it for a while now, for several years, and how, if I can call it, the left and the right have both marginalized mainstream media and have kind of polarized to their own kind of news sources, if I can call Breitbart and things like that, very loosely news sources. But what would your reflection be on that?
So broadly speaking, again, I would just use we're supposed to verify as much to what extent the things that we hear, right, the things that we see. So when you look at the kind of news media ecosystem, um, you have to just view things with a critical eye. But I think we also need to understand how this ecosystem has changed, right? So maybe a couple of decades ago, news media was very, very centrally controlled, very, very centralized, right? Now, what's happened is due to the digital disruption, that centralized control has begun to fray because digital has opened up the ability of anyone being able to create a platform, anyone being able to put information out and actually get an audience. So that has allowed new types of platforms to be created. So whereas I would say go back 20, 30 years, those legacy media institutions were obviously centralized and were obviously to some extent institutionally biased to some extent, right? But there was another side to that, which is even with those editorial constraints and structural kind of biases, and you can document that. They often wouldn't do. They were not doing objective coverage of Western interventions and all that kind of stuff, which we're familiar with. Now, what I think is quite interesting is what happened is that um, even this with that, these institutions did have standards, right? They had certain editorial standards and fact-checking processes, right? Which maintained a certain quality in the output. So even though there were biases, there were also certain things which wouldn't be put out.
Yeah.
So and what you can see is that where they became biased, you'd have to wear your filter and say, when they're talking about Western wars, they
Yeah.
tend to go to Western sources. So then maybe those sources might be correct sometimes, but they also could be biased and they could be concealing things. So when we saw with the Iraq weapons of mass destruction stuff, very much there was a lot of bias.
Yeah.
And when it's less close to home, then you might find actually so there might be less bias there. So you had to kind of use that kind of critical thinking. Now you've got this situation where you've got these centralized legacy institutions which are kind of hemorrhaging because they're losing money and they're being disrupted by digital.
Yeah.
That has allowed more different kind of actors to come in. Then at the same time, you've also got this weird situation where um, you've got these new upcoming digital platforms. Many of them don't really have standards, like they don't have fact checking standards and things like that. So then they just put stuff out, right? And some of it is random, and some of it is really biased. Some of it is trying to be objective. So you just need to we just need to realize that there are strengths and weaknesses with all of these things,
Yeah.
and we need to kind of have a kind of general kind of critical minded approach to evaluate all these different things kind of in a way which is impartial.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine. And so there's a question that's come through, and I'm going to read it out. It's I'm reading the book. I'm actually finding it quite overwhelming, the way ideology, racism, capitalism, and big money are overlapping. How do we push back as voluntary organizations and individuals who are sincere, but not as strong and often disunited? Is it mainly about funding and money?
So how do we push back? So I think, yeah, it does feel overwhelming when you're looking at this kind of stuff and you're thinking, um, what do we do? So what I would say is that you need to, we very much need to look at our context. When you're looking at the big global picture, there's a temptation to think, how do I change? I can't one person change the whole world, right? It just feels totally overwhelming. And that's where that feeling comes from to some extent, because we feel responsible, we want to have an impact. But what we need to do is focus on where we can actually act. Where can we have an impact? So that means what I always suggest to people is that just take some time to kind of look back at where you are and kind of assess where are my kind of skills? Where are the things that I feel I can have an impact, where I have my interests, and where can I pull and push levers around me, rather than thinking in a massive global economy. We can't suddenly stop Elon Musk doing what he's doing, but in a local context, there's a lot that we can do. We can have massive impact locally, and that is starts with building resilience with ourselves and helping others to begin to build that resilience too. So I would say, whether we're working in voluntary organizations or others, one of the things that we can start to do is work together with each other to say, how do we begin to coordinate our information, right? So we're able to understand what is going on. And I guess so again, it's these two things that we need to kind of help narrow our focus, right? How do I increase my ability to understand these things so that I can become a better communicator about these things? So when I'm encountering uh people who are not Muslim, for instance, who don't know, I'm able to kind of be an ambassador
Yeah.
for a better a very accurate way of seeing things. And I guess the second thing is kind of how do I embody that different way of doing things, that different way of being, which is much more aligned with these values, much more, how do I work in my organization to spread those things? And that can be in different ways. It can be as simple as I'm running a sports thing.
Sure.
So what can I do? You might say, if I'm going to do something, maybe I need to think about how I can reach out to communities that I've not reached out to. And I would say that one of the biggest things we can think about doing, one of the most important things that we must think about doing is coming out of our comfort zones, right? Coming out of I'm just doing things in the Muslim community amongst Muslims,
Yeah.
right? Because that's not the prophetic way. The prophet was always out of his comfort zone. He was always out there on the edge to the point that he was getting stuff thrown at him, right? And he was so brave. he continued. So we learn from this idea and we say, how do we go out into those communities, right, where they don't understand us, where they don't know who we are? I've not, how much contact have I had outside of my comfort zone? Let me find a way to do that. How do I bring people in to allow them to get that glimpse of that beauty that I can see in my religion, right? I think when we start doing this, I really think we're going to see some magic happen. I think we've neglected to do this as communities. We've neglected that fundamental responsibility. When we start doing that, we'll start seeing with our own eyes the way people can open up. Because sometimes it's not just about ideas and beliefs. You know, people might have weird ideas, stereotypes, don't even know where they're coming from. It's, a lot of it's unconscious, right? But when you meet someone and you share food, you know, or you share a thing, or you talk about a movie, program you watch, you share your experiences, suddenly that human relationship just is there. You know, that ihsan just comes out. And that point of connection, the soul meeting the soul, is there's nothing like it.
And would you say, Nafeez, that actually, so what you're describing is something that is, I would call short and medium term actions that people can do now, especially for the people who are actually listening to you here, young adults, maybe at the beginning of their careers, maybe they're at university. Is there something about thinking about the future? So not necessarily today, but thinking about their careers as they develop, as they expand their spheres of influence and the roles that they may be able to play in that.
So there's definitely important things to think about in terms of career. Um, and I would say, first of all, you know, think out, encourage yourself to think outside the box. Don't feel obliged to follow the traditional routes that might be prescribed. It is important to make sure that you feel that you're in a career where you can prosper, especially in this day and age, no doubt. But at the same time, looking at the things that prosper, I would suggest that you need to think about where are the areas of massive, exciting growth. And I would say that when you look at those things, you are looking at sectors like clean energy, like AI, like you know, information, like you know, food systems, um, as well as new ways of you know, kind of physics, new materials. There are key areas of our society where disruptive exponential change is taking place. And those exciting areas point us to the amazing possibilities that are emerging to create a really prosperous and amazing world. And what's also exciting about that is that many of those things are scaling without anyone even planning it. Like no one came up and hatched a plan to be like, let's have let's have, you know, smartphones take over the world. You know, there were it was fundamentally a disruptive type of technology. When it was created, it was cheaper, it was more efficient. There was a bunch of different tech that came together to make the smartphone. Screens, battery technology, other microprocessors, they kind of came together.
Yeah.
And then it created this amazing technology and disrupted landlines, right? And then it gave so many people the power to communicate in ways that were much more cheaply than ever before. Same thing with clean energy. Clean energy is just scaling. Trump can do what he wants. It's not going to stop. It's not going to stop scaling. Like it's going to costs are going down and they're just going down. The efficiency is improving and it's going to improve. And people who have studied this, and I'm one of them, who have looked at, they've done empirical forecasts. They have found that these technologies are going to scale. You know, you're looking at even by 2050, the global electricity system will be dominated by solar power, something like 80%. Um, and you know, you can delay that projection and you can accelerate that projection, and it's not fast enough right now to escape the ravages of climate change. So we need to do more. But what's interesting is that projection was based on what happens if you don't do it, you just carry on.
Yeah.
You don't have radical climate policies or anything like that. It just carries on. That's purely the market forces and economics playing out, right? Same thing with AI, right?
Yeah.
AI is scaling. We know it's coming. We know it's happening. So we need to look at these technologies and think about how do we harness these technologies, regulate these technologies? Because what it's like, what we're seeing is that our material capabilities are increasing. We're getting the ability to do things on the planet and on the earth in a way which is potentially better, cleaner, and creates more prosperity for people. But it won't work if everything is owned and controlled by Elon Musk, right?
Yeah.
Like if people like him own and control everything, it won't work. So we need to be doing a number of things. First of all, where are these great sectors where we think I can have the most bang for my buck? If I move into that sector, I can have a really good impact. That's where things are going to change. That's where there's going to be prosperity. At the same time, it's not all about the tech. It's also about the ethics, the governance, the
Yeah.
what's the economic paradigm look like? What's the political model look like? Because now we need to regulate these things in a new way. We can't just do it with the old system. The old way of regulating things was built around the old stuff, which is disappearing, like, centralized hierarchical oil and gas. Decentralized clean energy works very, very differently. So we need a new type of system, which is and so that's the other area of excitement is what are the social systems, what are the economic systems, what are the political systems, what are the ethical values that we need to innovate in order to regulate these systems. And I think as Muslims, we really have an amazing contribution to make as well, inspired by our faith values, inspired by our teachings in the Quran and the Hadith. There's so much wisdom about how we interact with the earth, how we understand the role of technology, how we regulate technology. The Quran is not a anti-technology book. It's something which is very positive about humanity's relationship with the earth. It warns about us spreading corruption on the earth if we damage the balance, but it also talks about how Allah has made everything in the universe potentially subservient to us.
Yeah.
So the scope, I do believe, is tremendous if we put our hearts and minds to it.
Amazing. Thank you. I've got loads of questions, but sadly, time is at an end. I'm just going to leave by just reminding everybody to buy this book, please. Please read it. Absolutely essential reading. So, so important to really understand our context and where we go, as has been alluded to, indeed, by Nafeez through these kind of questions that we've been asking. From my side, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. Such an important topic. Adil, I'm going to hand back to you, if that's okay, to close the meeting. But Jazakallah khair. Thank you, Nafeez.
Thank you so much.